The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when Frank Thompson carefully buttoned up his neatly pressed blue shirt. At 83 years old, his fingers weren't as quick as they used to be, but he still made sure every button was perfectly aligned. Old habits from his military days never really went away, even after all these years. Every morning, Frank followed the same routine in his small, tidy house at the end of Oak Street. He would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., make his bed with hospital corners just like he learned in basic training, and get dressed for the day. His closet held a row of identical blue shirts and khaki pants, all pressed and arranged by color. Sarah, his late wife, used to tease him about being so organized, but these habits gave him comfort now that she was gone. Looking in the mirror, Frank adjusted the Vietnam veteran pin on his shirt collar. His white hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, he stood as straight as his back would allow. The cane leaning against his dresser was his only concession to getting older. He didn't like using it, but his doctor had insisted after his fall last winter. At precisely 7:15 a.m., Frank locked his front door and began his daily walk to Mary's diner. It wasn't a long journey, just 3 blocks, but he took his time, enjoying the fresh morning air and greeting his neighbors. Mrs. Anderson was already out watering her roses, and she waved as he passed by. The newspaper boy, young Tommy, always made sure to hand-deliver Frank's paper instead of throwing it on the lawn like the others. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Tommy called out, running up with the day's paper. "Did you watch the baseball game last night?" Frank smiled, reaching into his pocket for a quarter, his daily tip for the boy. "Sure did, Tommy. Those Yankees really need to work on their pitching, don't they?" The boy grinned, accepted the quarter, and rushed off to finish his route. These small interactions meant a lot to Frank since Sarah passed away 3 years ago. They helped fill the quiet spaces in his life. Mary's diner came into view as Frank rounded the corner. The small bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open, announcing his arrival. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around him like a warm blanket. This place had been his second home for the past 30 years. "Morning, Frank," called Mary from behind the counter. She was already pouring his coffee, black, no sugar, into his usual blue mug with the Marine Corps logo. Mary's father had been a Marine too, which was one of the reasons Frank had first started coming here. "Morning, Mary," Frank replied, making his way to his usual corner booth. He liked this spot because he could see the whole diner from here, and his back was against the wall, another old habit from his military days that he never quite shook. The morning regulars were all in their usual places. Bob the mailman sat at the counter, eating his daily breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. The Johnson sisters occupied their usual table by the window, sharing a newspaper and arguing about the crossword puzzle. Everything was exactly as it should be. Mary's teenage granddaughter, Jenny, brought over his usual breakfast order: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and hash browns. She knew better than to ask what he wanted. Frank hadn't changed his breakfast order in 20 years. "Here you go, Mr. Thompson," Jenny said, carefully placing the plate in front of him. Grandma made sure the toast was extra crispy, just how you like it. Frank smiled at the young girl. "Thank you, Jenny. How's school going? Still having trouble with that algebra?" Jenny's face lit up. "Actually, those tips you gave me really helped. I got a B+ on my last test." As Jenny moved on to her other tables, Frank unfolded his newspaper and settled into his morning routine. The diner's quiet chatter and clinking dishes created a comfortable background noise as he read about the day's events. Through the window, you could see the town coming to life as shops began to open and more cars appeared on the street. This was Frank's peaceful world. Predictable, comfortable, and safe. But he didn't know that today would be different. Today would be the day when his quiet morning routine would be disrupted by the loud rumble of motorcycle engines approaching Mary's diner, bringing with them a change that would turn his world upside down. The peaceful morning atmosphere at Mary's diner shattered as 5 loud motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. The roar of their engines made the windows rattle, causing several customers to jump in their seats. Frank looked up from his newspaper, his coffee cup pausing halfway to his mouth. Through the window, he watched as the bikers dismounted their machines. They were all big men, wearing black leather jackets covered in patches and chains. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattooed arms, pushed open the diner's door so hard that the bell nearly fell off. The quiet morning chatter stopped immediately. Mary, who had been refilling coffee cups, froze behind the counter. The 5 bikers stomped their way through the diner, their heavy boots loud against the tile floor. They headed straight for Frank's corner. "Hey, old-timer," the leader said, towering over Frank's table. "Nice spot you got here. Think it's time for a change, don't you?" His voice was rough, like gravel being crushed underfoot. Frank looked up calmly, his hand steady as he folded his newspaper. "I've been sitting here for 20 years, young man," he said quietly. The biker laughed, a harsh sound that made Jenny drop a spoon behind the counter. "Well, times change, Grandpa. This is our spot now." He turned to his friends. "Boys, help the elderly gentleman find a new seat." 2 of the bikers stepped forward. One of them picked up Frank's coffee cup and plate, walking them to a small table near the restrooms. The other grabbed Frank's cane and held it just out of reach. "Come on, old-timer. Time to move," the biker with Frank's cane said, grinning. Mary stepped forward from behind the counter. "Now listen here," she started, but the leader cut her off with a sharp look. "Lady, we're paying customers just like anyone else. We got a right to sit where we want," he said. His tone made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. Frank slowly stood up, his joints protesting the movement. Without his cane, he had to steady himself against the table. The bikers watched and snickered as he carefully made his way to the small table where they had moved his breakfast. "Look at him wobble," one of them whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Like a baby learning to walk." The Johnson sisters gathered their things and hurried out, leaving their half-finished breakfast behind. Bob the mailman stared down at his plate, his face red with anger, but afraid to speak up. Jenny had tears in her eyes as she watched Frank struggle to his new seat. The bikers sprawled across Frank's former booth, their loud voices and rough laughter filling the diner. They ordered breakfast, demanding special changes to every item and complaining about the prices. When Jenny brought their food, they made rude comments that made her hands shake as she set down their plates. From his new spot, Frank could barely see the rest of the diner. The table wobbled, and the harsh fluorescent light from the nearby restroom sign buzzed constantly. His coffee had gotten cold during the move, but he didn't ask for more. He didn't want Jenny to have to walk past the bikers again. Mary tried to make things better by bringing him a fresh cup of coffee herself. "I'm so sorry, Frank," she whispered. "I don't know what to do. I can't afford to lose customers, but this isn't right." Frank patted her hand gently. "It's okay, Mary, I understand." But his eyes, usually bright and kind, had grown dark with something more than just sadness. The rest of the morning was nothing like the peaceful breakfasts Frank had enjoyed for so many years. The bikers' loud voices drowned out the usual friendly chatter. Their crude jokes and constant swearing made other customers leave quickly, many without finishing their meals. As Frank finally stood to leave, one of the bikers called out, "See you tomorrow, Grandpa. Better find yourself a new spot." Walking home that day, leaning heavily on his cane, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, not fear, but a slow-burning determination. These young men thought they could bully an old veteran, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Tomorrow would be different, Frank decided. Tomorrow, he would show them exactly what kind of man they were trying to push around. Over the next 2 weeks, things at Mary's Diner got worse every day. The bikers arrived earlier each morning, making sure they were there before Frank. They turned his peaceful corner booth into their noisy headquarters, filling the air with cigarette smoke, even though there was a no smoking sign on the wall. One particularly bad morning, Frank walked into the diner using his cane, his back straight despite his years. The leader of the bikers, who everyone now knew as Snake, stuck out his boot as Frank passed their table. Frank managed to catch himself before falling, but his newspaper scattered across the floor. "Oops," Snake said with a mean smile. "Guess your eyes aren't what they used to be, old-timer." His friends laughed loudly, slapping the table and spilling their coffee. Jenny rushed over to help pick up Frank's newspaper, but one of the bikers got there first. He picked up the pages and made paper airplanes, sailing them across the diner. "Here's your morning news, Grandpa," he shouted. Mary watched from behind the counter, her hands gripping a coffee pot so tight her knuckles turned white. The diner was nearly empty now. Most regular customers had stopped coming. The Johnson sisters hadn't been seen in 10 days. Bob the mailman now got his breakfast at the gas station down the street. Frank sat at his small wobbly table near the restrooms, carefully smoothing out his wrinkled newspaper pages. His coffee cup shook slightly as he lifted it, not from fear or age, but from holding back his anger. He faced worse than these bullies in Vietnam, but back then, he'd had his Marine unit behind him. The bikers grew bolder as the morning went on. They started a game of throwing sugar packets at Frank's head when Mary wasn't looking. Each time one hit him, Frank didn't react. He just kept reading his damaged newspaper, taking small sips of his coffee. "What's wrong, old man?" one of the younger bikers called out. "Too scared to say anything? Maybe we should help you find a retirement home instead." Jenny came to refill Frank's coffee, her eyes red from crying in the kitchen. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, "Grandma's thinking about selling the diner. We're losing too many customers, and she's afraid things will get violent." Frank looked up at the teenager who had become like a granddaughter to him. "Tell your grandmother not to worry, Jenny," he said softly. "Sometimes the darkest hour comes just before dawn." Around 9:30 a.m., Snake decided to step up their game. He walked over to Frank's table, carrying his half-eaten breakfast plate. "Hey, Veterans Home Reject, I think you need some more fiber in your diet." With that, he dumped his leftover eggs and bacon onto Frank's newspaper. The diner went completely silent. Even the kitchen staff stopped what they were doing to watch. Frank slowly stood up, using his cane for support. For the first time since the bikers had arrived, he looked Snake directly in the eyes. What Snake saw in those aged but steel-hard eyes made him take a small step back. There was something there he hadn't noticed before, a quiet strength, a dangerous calm that reminded him of his old man when he was about to teach someone a serious lesson. "Young man," Frank said, his voice steady and clear, "tomorrow morning, I'm going to teach you and your friends something about respect. Something your parents should have taught you long ago." Snake tried to laugh, but it came out weak. "Oh yeah? What's a broken-down old-timer like you going to teach us?" Frank smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that had made enemy soldiers think twice during his time in Vietnam. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "you'll learn why the Marines teach us that it's not the age of the dog in the fight that matters. It's the fight in the dog." With that, Frank picked up his cane and walked out of the diner, leaving a very confused group of bikers behind. For the first time since they'd started coming to Mary's diner, they were completely silent. Mary watched Frank leave, noticing how he seemed taller somehow, more like the Marine he used to be. She smiled to herself, remembering stories her father had told her about never underestimating an old veteran. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. The next morning dawned gray and cool. Frank woke up earlier than usual and spent extra time getting ready. He polished his combat boots, the same ones he'd kept pristine since Vietnam. Instead of his usual blue shirt, he put on his Marine dress uniform. Every medal and ribbon told a story of bravery and sacrifice. His hands moved slowly but surely as he adjusted each pin and badge. At exactly 7:00 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than his usual time, Frank walked into Mary's diner. The bikers were already there, lounging in his old corner booth. The usual smell of coffee and bacon was heavy in the air, but today there was also tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Well, look what we have here," Snake called out, his voice loud but somewhat uncertain. The old-timers playing dress-up. The other bikers laughed, but their laughter sounded forced. Frank walked straight to their table, his combat boots making a distinct sound on the tile floor. His cane tapped along with each step, creating a rhythm that somehow made everyone in the diner hold their breath. Even the cook stopped flipping pancakes to watch. "You want to show us something, old man?" one of the younger bikers asked, trying to sound tough, but his eyes kept moving to the rows of medals on Frank's chest. Snake stood up, trying to use his height to intimidate Frank. "Listen, Grandpa, that uniform might have meant something 50 years ago, but..." Before Snake could finish, Frank reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small stack of photographs. Without saying a word, he laid them one by one on the table. The first showed a young Marine standing next to a military motorcycle, his face young but serious. It was Frank, 40 years younger. The second photo showed the same young Frank with a group of other Marines, all mounting their bikes. The third photo made Snake's face turn pale. In it, Frank's motorcycle unit was receiving medals, and standing proudly next to them was a man who looked exactly like Snake. That's impossible," Snake whispered, picking up the photo with trembling hands. "That's my father, Sergeant James Rattler Wilson." Frank spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying throughout the now silent diner. Your father was one of the bravest men I ever commanded. We rode together with the 1st Marine Division Motorcycle Unit. We carried messages through enemy territory when radio signals were too risky. Your father saved my life twice. Snake's hands were shaking as he stared at the photo. The other bikers crowded around to look, their faces showing shock and shame. The last time I saw your father, Frank continued, he made me promise to watch out for his son if our paths ever crossed. He said you were just a baby then, but he hoped you'd grow up to be a man of honor. Frank's eyes locked with Snake's. I don't think he'd be very proud of how you've been acting in this diner. Snake fell heavily back into his seat, the photograph still clutched in his hands. The tough biker facade crumbled as tears formed in his eyes. Dad never talked much about his service, he said softly. He died when I was 15. I had no idea. Frank placed his cane against the table and slowly, carefully sat down in the booth across from Snake. Your father was more than just a brave Marine. He taught the entire unit about respect, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He used to say that true strength isn't about intimidation, it's about lifting others up. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, some removing their caps, others staring at the floor. The youngest one suddenly blurted out, "Sir, we didn't know, we're so sorry." Mary appeared with a fresh pot of coffee, tears streaming down her face. Jenny followed with extra cups for everyone. The diner remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, respectful, almost reverent. Frank reached across the table and put his hand on Snake's shoulder. Your father also taught me something else, he said gently. He taught me that it's never too late to change course when you're heading in the wrong direction. Snake looked up, his eyes red but clear. In that moment, everyone in Mary's diner knew they were witnessing something powerful, the moment when a lifetime of service and honor met the opportunity for redemption. The atmosphere in Mary's diner had completely changed. Snake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking more like a lost boy than the tough biker leader he pretended to be. Frank pulled out more photographs from his uniform pocket, laying them carefully on the table. Your father, Frank said, pointing to a photo of a young man on a military motorcycle, earned his nickname Rattler not because he was dangerous, but because he could sense trouble coming from miles away. He saved our entire unit more times than I can count. The other bikers pulled their chairs closer, their earlier arrogance replaced by genuine interest. Even Mary and Jenny sat down to listen, the morning's cooking temporarily forgotten. The smell of slightly burnt toast drifted from the kitchen, but nobody seemed to notice. Tell us about my dad, Snake said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Please. Frank picked up one of the photos showing their unit lined up with their motorcycles. We were the Silent Sons, that's what they called us. When regular communications were too risky, we carried messages through enemy territory. Your father was my best rider. I remember the bikes in our garage, Snake said. Dad used to work on them all the time, but he never talked about where he rode them. Frank nodded, pointing to another picture. This one showed Sergeant Wilson helping a young Vietnamese child onto his motorcycle. This was your father's finest moment. We were passing through a village that had been hit hard by fighting. This little girl was separated from her family. Your father not only found her family in the next village, but he also started a program to help other lost children. The youngest biker raised his hand like a schoolboy. Sir, how did you guys handle the bikes in the jungle? It must have been really tough. Frank smiled, warming to his audience. We modified those machines ourselves. Added special tires for the mud, reinforced the frames for rough terrain. Your father, he looked at Snake, was our best mechanic. He could fix anything with just a wrench and some wire. That's why he became a motorcycle mechanic after the war. Snake said softly. He opened that little shop where I grew up. I used to watch him work, but he never explained where he learned it all. Frank pulled out another photograph. This one was different. It showed their unit receiving medals. This was taken after Operation Thundercloud. We had to deliver crucial intelligence through 30 miles of enemy territory. Your father's bike broke down halfway through, but he fixed it under fire. Didn't even flinch when the bullets were flying. Snake touched the medal on his father's chest in the photo. I have this medal at home. Found it in his stuff after he died. I never knew what it was for. Silver Star, Frank said proudly, for valor under fire. Your father earned every bit of it. One of the other bikers, a man with gray in his beard, spoke up. I served too, sir. Afghanistan. Never knew about these motorcycle units in Vietnam. Frank nodded. Most people don't. We worked quietly, behind the scenes. But every successful mission meant save lives. Your father, he turned back to Snake, always said our real mission wasn't just delivering messages, it was delivering hope. Jenny brought fresh coffee for everyone, her eyes wide as she listened. The morning sun now streamed through the diner's windows, making the chrome on Frank's medals shine. The day your father saved my life, Frank continued, his voice growing softer, we were caught in an ambush. My bike took a hit, and I was thrown into a ditch. Your father rode back through heavy fire, picked me up, and carried me out on his bike. Never once complained about the extra weight slowing him down. Snake stared at the photos spread across the table, seeing his father in a completely new light. I always wondered why he insisted on helping every broken-down biker who came to his shop, even when they couldn't pay. Because that's who he was, Frank said firmly. A man who lived by the code of honor, brotherhood, and service. He believed every person deserved respect and help, no matter who they were. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Snake looked around the diner, at the mess they'd made over the past weeks, at the fear they'd caused, at the respect they'd failed to show. His father's legacy suddenly felt like a weight on his shoulders. Sir, he said to Frank, his voice cracking slightly, I think it's time we started living up to my father's example. The next morning, the rumble of motorcycles outside Mary's diner sounded different somehow, less threatening, more respectful. When the door opened, Snake led his group in quietly. All 5 bikers had cleaned up. Their leather jackets were neat, their boots wiped clean. Each man carried something under his arm. Frank was already at his corner booth, the same one the bikers had taken from him. But today, instead of tension, there was an empty chair waiting at his table. Snake approached first, placing a carefully wrapped package on the table. Mr. Thompson, Snake said, his voice soft and serious, we spent all night talking about everything you told us. About my father, about honor, about what it means to be real men. He gestured to the package. We'd like you to open this. Frank carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a leather vest, similar to what the bikers wore, but different. On the back was a new patch, a Marine Corps emblem surrounded by the words, Silent Son's Legacy, honoring our veterans. We stayed up all night making this, the youngest biker explained. Snake's dad had an old leather shop in his garage. We found the tools and, he trailed off, suddenly embarrassed. Frank ran his fingers over the careful stitching. This is fine work, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Your father would be proud of this craftsmanship, Snake. The other bikers stepped forward one by one, each placing something on the table. The gray-bearded Afghanistan veteran put down a folded American flag in a triangle case. Found this in my attic, sir. Thought it deserved to be displayed here in the diner. Another biker brought out a polished motorcycle part, an old headlight. It's from a 1967 military bike, he explained. We found it in Snake's dad's shop. Thought maybe it could be part of a memorial display. The 4th biker placed a framed photograph on the table. It showed Snake's father's old motorcycle shop. We're reopening the shop, he announced. Snake's gonna run it, just like his dad did. Free repairs for any veteran who needs help. The youngest biker seemed nervous as he put down a notebook. Sir, we wrote down all the stories you told us about the Silent Sons. We thought maybe you could check them for accuracy. We want to make sure we tell them right when people ask about our new patch. Mary watched from behind the counter, tears in her eyes. Jenny was already rearranging a shelf near the entrance to make room for the flag and memorabilia. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, making the polished headlight gleam. There's more, Snake said, pulling out a chair to sit with Frank. We decided to change our club's mission. Instead of causing trouble, we're going to start a veteran support group. Escort services for military funerals, motorcycle therapy for PTSD veterans, charity rides for military families in need. Frank looked at each man's face, seeing the sincerity in their eyes. These weren't the same bullies who had terrorized the diner just days ago. These were men who had found a purpose. Last night, Snake continued, his voice catching, I called my mom. Asked her about Dad's military service. She cried when I told her what we're doing. said Dad always wanted me to understand what brotherhood really meant. The other bikers nodded, and the gray-bearded veteran spoke up. We've already got 3 other motorcycle clubs interested in joining our veteran support mission. They want to honor the Silent Sons too. Frank slowly stood up, picking up the leather vest. With dignity, he put it on over his regular shirt. It fit perfectly. The other customers in the diner, including Bob the mailman and the Johnson sisters, who had finally returned, broke into spontaneous applause. Your father, Frank said to Snake, once told me that a man's legacy isn't in the noise he makes, but in the silence he leaves behind. The peaceful silence that comes after doing what's right. He looked around at the transformed bikers. I think you boys are starting to understand what he meant. Mary brought over coffee for everyone, served in special new mugs with the Marine Corps emblem. As she poured, Snake stood up and addressed the whole diner. From now on, he declared, this place isn't just Mary's diner. It's home base for the Silent Sons Legacy Motorcycle Club. And our first mission is to make sure every veteran who walks through that door feels like family. 6 months had passed since the day Frank wore his Marine uniform to the diner. Mary's Diner had become famous in 3 states as the Veterans' Haven. On this bright Sunday morning, the parking lot was filled with motorcycles, their chrome sparkling in the sunlight. Inside, Frank sat in his corner booth, but he wasn't alone anymore. Snake sat across from him, showing him plans for their newest project, turning the empty warehouse behind Snake's father's old motorcycle shop into a veterans' community center. Look, Commander, Snake said excitedly, spreading out the blueprints. We'll have a medical clinic here, job training center here, and this whole section will be for PTSD support groups. His eyes shined with pride. The mayor approved all our permits yesterday. Frank nodded approvingly, sipping his coffee from his special mug, a birthday gift from the bikers with Original Silent Sun engraved on it. Your father would be proud, son. He always said that a building is just walls until you fill it with heart. The diner was bustling with its usual Sunday morning crowd. Veterans of all ages sat at tables, sharing stories and friendship. The walls were now covered with even more photographs, not just from Vietnam, but from all conflicts. Each picture told a story of service and sacrifice. Jenny, now wearing a Silent Sons Legacy t-shirt with her waitress apron, brought over a fresh pot of coffee. Mr. Thompson, wait until you see what's coming. She could barely contain her excitement. Through the window, they saw a long line of motorcycles approaching. Leading them was the gray-bearded Afghanistan veteran, and behind him rode at least 50 bikers, each with an American flag mounted on their bike. That's the escort for today's special delivery, Snake explained, grinning. Remember that letter we wrote to the Pentagon about your old unit? Frank's eyes widened as the door opened. In walked a group of elderly men, each wearing a Marine veteran cap. One of them stepped forward, his eyes searching the room until they found Frank. Commander Thompson, the man said, his voice shaking. Remember your radio operator, Static Stevens? Frank stood up slowly, his hands trembling. Static, is that really you? The 2 old Marines embraced, tears flowing freely. One by one, the other men came forward, all surviving members of the original Silent Sons motorcycle unit. Mary quickly rearranged tables to make room for everyone. The younger bikers rushed to help the elderly veterans with their chairs, hanging on every word as the old soldiers began sharing stories. Remember that time in the monsoon? Static asked, laughing, when Rattler's bike got stuck in the mud and he refused to leave it behind. Snake listened intently, hearing new stories about his father. The youngest biker was recording everything on his phone. They had started a YouTube channel sharing veterans' stories, which had already reached hundreds of thousands of views. The Johnson sisters brought out a special cake they had baked, decorated with the Silent Sons Legacy emblem. Bob the mailman, who had become the club's official photographer, took pictures of everything. We got one more surprise, Snake announced, standing up. He nodded to Tommy, who wheeled in something large covered with a tarp. Commander Thompson, we found this in my dad's old storage unit. Took us 3 months to restore it. They pulled off the tarp to reveal a perfectly restored 1967 military motorcycle, exactly like the ones Frank's unit had ridden in Vietnam. The old vehicle gleamed like new, complete with original markings and equipment bags. It's not just for show, Snake said proudly. We've got it registered and ready to ride. and we thought maybe, if you're up for it, you could lead our Veterans Day parade next month. Frank walked around the motorcycle, touching it gently. Memories flooded back, not of war, but of brotherhood, of purpose, of young men riding through danger to help others. He looked around at the transformed diner, at the mix of old and young veterans, at the bikers who had become like sons to him. You know, Frank said, his voice strong and clear, your father once told me that the measure of a man isn't in how tough he acts, but in how many lives he makes better. He smiled at Snake. I think he'd be amazed at how many lives you boys have touched. Mary rang the diner's bell, something she now did every Sunday morning. Everyone stood, veterans and bikers alike, and raised their coffee cups in a silent toast to fallen comrades, to new beginnings, and to the power of respect and understanding to change hearts. The Silent Son's legacy had become more than just a story of redemption. It had become a movement, spreading across the country, proving that it's never too late to choose a better path. And it all started in a small diner where an old veteran had the courage to stand up, and a group of bikers had the wisdom to listen.